Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Dan Cordelicchio. I want to welcome you to the Destination Health Podcast, where we motivate, we educate, we inspire. We are truly grateful. We have Dr. Kirk Parsley on our podcast today, and we're going to get right into it. Dr. Parsley, thank you very much for being on today.
Hey, thanks for giving me a soapbox, man.
Yeah, man, it's all good. So just a brief bio. Served as an Undersea medical officer at Naval Special Warfare Group. While he was supervised and he developed a group for Sports Medicine and Rehabilitation Center. Former Navy SEAL, thank you for your service. It's very important to say that. Medical doctor, member of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, Naval Special Warfare expert in sleep medicine. Welcome. Very excited to have you on. So everybody wants to know the first question, why did you become a Navy SEAL and how was that?
Yeah, well, I think I became a SEAL. I grew up in a small town, kind of rural Texas. It's just almost an assumption that you're going to go in the military from birth. I mean, it's just kind of what the men do is they go do their obligation, they move on, family history supports the idea that people who go to the military usually end up having better lives after they come out and do their thing. So that was always something that I felt like I would do. It depended kind of on how well I did athletically, if I would go to college first or whatever. And turns out I was a really good athlete and a terrible student, so college wasn't an option.
Although you did become a medical physician, right?
Yeah, I mean, I actually dropped out of school, dropped out of high school.
Interesting.
And joined the military. Got a GED and wanted to be a SEAL just because I read and learned and watched. There's a documentary out on this news journalism show called 48 Hours. It's like 60 minutes, and they covered a SEAL class and read a lot about it. What was available. There wasn't a lot of information in those days. SEALs didn't have the status they have now, and but it was touted as the toughest training in the world.
Right.
This is absolutely the hardest thing you can possibly do in the military. I'm like, well, let's see if I can do that.
Let's see. Let's go for it.
So that's what I did, and I made it through training. Went to the SEAL teams. I was I was in the SEAL teams during the end of the Clinton administration and the first George W. Administration. So I'm sorry for. Yeah. His father, right? Whoever was in charge when we had the Gulf War, that's his father, right? It's his father.
Yes, it was his father. Correct.
Yeah. So George Senior, and so we didn't have the kind of combat that people have now. Like the Gulf War was a limited skirmish, and my platoon didn't even go over there. We were in the Philippines, so. I think it just really kind of was becoming redundant to me. I was doing the same training trips, the same. Yeah, you group up with another platoon and you train for a year and then you deploy. You mainly do FID. You go out, you train other people, special forces, to do what we do, and you do some limited police action and protection. And and it wasn't that I wasn't glad that I did it. It was just like, there's something else to be done at this point now. So let's see what else I can do. And I was dating a girl who was in physical therapy school. And she's getting her master's in physical therapy. And I was taking her textbooks on deployment with me to read, things like, physiology, anatomy, physiology, kinesiology books, and mainly to make myself a better athlete. I've been a competitive athlete pretty much my whole life. Thought, well, maybe I'd go to physical therapy school. So I started volunteering because you need 2,000 volunteer hours just to apply to a physical therapy school. Got out of the Navy, started college, started at a junior college. I had to because I didn't have a high school diploma. And then, started doing my volunteer hours. They hired me as a PT assistant. And then that's what I did all through college. But pretty quickly decided that PT was too limited for me.
Mm-hmm.
And, didn't even find out that as far as I was concerned, my time in the military was done. That was a closed chapter.
Mm-hmm.
But I was already married, already had a kid, another kid on the way when I was applying to medical school. Found out that the military had their own medical school and that they would pay me to go to medical school instead of the other way around. And I was like, well, that's pretty hard to pass up.
Right. Sure.
and obviously nothing's free, right? You pay for that with time.
That's right. Because what do you have to give, like 8 years after?
8 years after medical school.
After graduation.
So I thought, well, I'll get back to the SEAL teams. I'll go get back to the community. I'll be a doctor out there for a while. I'll get out and I'll move on with my life. And that's pretty much what happened. But when as you alluded to in the bio, when I got there, they just funded the very first sports medicine facility that the West Coast SEAL teams had ever had. People would have thought that we were treated like professional athletes, but not at all. You went out, you exercised with your platoon or your team, and you did kind of whatever the leadership liked doing. So if they liked running and swimming, you did a lot of running and swimming. And,
right.
If they liked calisthenics, you did a bunch of calisthenics, and whatever. So there's really no organization to it. We didn't have our own rehab facility, so the SEALs would have to go across the bridge and to downtown San Diego to do something like physical therapy. And now it's taking 4 hours out of their day to do a visit, So we built out our first, I got to supervise that build out, I was involved in hiring our first nutritionist, our first strength and conditioning coach, our first physical therapist, our first athletic trainer, first chiropractor, our first acupuncture, like everything that we brought in.
Right.
I was fortunate enough to be at the forefront of that. And then, of course, I was the dumbest guy in the room because I'd brought in all the expertise that knew way more about what they did than I did.
Right.
So in the military fashion, they then put me in charge of supervising all these people. And so that was my job, but I was still the doctor for the SEALs. And so the SEALs, because I was a SEAL, trusted me. They would come sit in my office. They come close the door behind them and say, "Hey, man, let me tell you what's really going on," because they're just like a professional athlete.
Right.
The worst thing that can happen is you put them on the bench. They don't want to be sidelined. So when they go see their doctor, they're like, "Everything's great." Like, "Yep, perfect."
Right.
You sure? No aches, no pains, nope. Everything's great, man. Yeah, they'll try to hide gunshot wounds. Like, they don't care. It's like just whatever it takes to get back with their platoon. They don't want to be sidelined. So they came in, they were honest with me. They had this whole litany of symptoms that you would expect if they were 40 pounds overweight and 60 and pre-diabetic. But you didn't expect it from the guy who's sitting in front of you, who's 28 to 35 and really, really muscular and in good shape.
They're just jacked from the training and so forth.
Yeah.
Right.
And honestly, I had no idea. I was like, I don't have a clue, because medical school taught me how to recognize, diagnose and treat diseases. And these guys didn't have a disease. They just weren't performing to where they felt like they should perform.
So there was this subpar performance that was going on at the time.
And by and large, 99% of the time, it was only their assessment of their performance. It had nothing to do with anybody telling them that they had done anything wrong, that they were losing a step or anything. Their perception of themselves is that they should be better than they are. And after 100 guys sat in my office and told me the exact same story, and I took diligent notes off of everyone, the 100th or so guy who came in, a light bulb went off in my head when he said he took Ambien every night. And I thought, it seems like that's really common with the guys who are coming to talk to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I go back through my records. Every single person who's been in my office was taking Ambien every night.
He's taking Ambien.
And I was like, Occam's razor, right? Like, I don't know anything at this point. Like, I'm a medical doctor. I don't know anything about sleep. I've never had a single class on sleep. Like,
right.
Nothing.
And it's
I've
really
never taught anything.
And we really should, because it's so important, and that's what we're going to get into.
Yeah. And so I started educating myself on what sleep is, what happens when you sleep, how do these sleep drugs, like, first thing I look at, like, go to the medical literature and say, could Ambien be causing, like, could the side effects of Ambien be causing any of this?
Right.
And pretty quickly you realize, even though the pharmaceutical company gets to cherry pick and put out their data the way they want to, but reading between the lines, once you know just a tiny bit about sleep, you can go, well, I bet you that has some, I bet you that has some of these effects. And, fortunately, the SEALs had, this near celebrity status that they have now. And so I could call people who are experts, and I'd read a book and I'd call the author, I'd watch a TED talk and I'd call the speaker, and I'd just say, I'd go to a medical conference and on integrative and functional medicine, and I'd hear someone speak that was powerful. I'd go talk to them, say, hey, I'm the physician for the West Coast Navy SEALs. We're having some problems that I think your expertise would help with. Would you mind if I train with you? Could I consult with you? Could I run patients by you? Could I come proctor? Like anything, whatever, like anything you'd be willing to do. Every single guy was helpful, and just allowed me to super steep learning curve on really lifestyle medicine, but by and large, I was focusing heavily on sleep until I kind of added in the complication of all the traumatic brain injuries that they have, and the symptomology of that looks very similar to the sleep.
And I'm sure there's a lot of TBIs, right?
Yeah. I mean,
military, right?
I mean, if you look at the concussive injury of blast, so this is one of the things that happened. I went to a TBI lecture, blanking on his name, Mark. He's a really well-known TBI doc. I get his newsletter every week, and I'm blanking on his name right now. But he was working with pugilists and NFL players, and he starts throwing up their case reports, and he's showing their hormones and inflammatory cascades and oxidative and like all the stuff that was aberrant to my guys that made no sense for their age. And his cases looked exactly like my cases. And then he started talking about the treatment that he did, and I'm like, Mark Gordon, that's his name. And I was like, man, that looks exactly like my guys. The labs look exactly like the labs. The symptoms sound exactly like the same symptoms. But I was in the military. He was just treating people with hormones because he's a medical doctor. So when your hormones are low, you give me more hormones, right? If something's too high, you give you something that blocks that and makes it low. And so that's what I wanted to do, is adjust make all the numbers fit by giving stuff, right? And the military wasn't about to let me do that, right? So that wasn't an option. So I had to find other ways. And, unfortunately, getting guys to sleep doubled and tripled their testosterone levels anyway, and so a lot of stuff re-regulated. And I really started talking about sleep. I would give these sleep lectures that were 90% about hormones. And I'd talk about the hormones that these guys know about, because they're performance-oriented people. And it's, as you can imagine, it's not an organization that values sleep a whole lot. I probably chose the worst two professions for it, like, being a Navy SEAL and being a doctor. Like,
right, because you have to go through hell week.
Positions there, positions out there. So they didn't really. It was hard to kind of get them to be interested in sleep. Like when we go through, when we go through training, we go through a week without sleep, like a full week. Like that, obviously you don't need it. It's a luxury, right? Like, no, it's really important. So, but I could talk to them about hormones. I say, like, here's the evidence. When you sleep just 2 hours less than you need, this is what happens to your hormones. When you drink alcohol before you sleep, this is what happens to your hormones. When you take sleep drugs, this is what happens to your hormones. And so it was almost a sleight of hand for me to get to talk to them about hormones, and motivate them. But the true treatment was to enhance sleep. And there were a few guys that were older that ended up on hormone replacement therapy, but those were guys nearing 50, those aren't like 28-year-olds and 30-year-olds and
Right.
35-year-olds who are coming in with these problems. And that just led to me drinking more and more of my own Kool-Aid. Reading more and more. I met Rob Wolf
Hmm.
and John Wellborn and Chris
Hmm.
Kresser and like all those guys. We would be
Yep.
at
Yes.
symposiums lecturing together, and that just kind of led to me being this sleep guy. And
Right.
and so I just embraced the idea. When I got all the guys off of Ambien, I had to give them something in the place of that, right? You couldn't just
Correct.
take it away and say suck it up. So I worked with the guys to come up with this concoction of supplements that they were having to
Hmm.
go buy all over town, and some were pills and some were liquids and some were powders, and they were
Right.
like it was a total pain for them. So they kept pressuring me to make a product out of it for them, and that's where the sleep supplement that I have, that's where that came from. It was really
Right.
just to get them off my back. And it turned out to be a reasonably successful business venture. So, I've continued with that, but as always, like it's called a supplement for a reason. It's supplemental. The first thing is to do, to live your life as close to the ideal as possible. And then
Right.
there's a reality that you can get to. And then in between here, that's where we mess around with, you know,
Because
supplements
you,
and gadgets and techniques and tricks. And
right.
like that, we bridge that gap.
Yeah, because we can't out supplement a bad diet or out supplement a bad lifestyle. You know,
No, no.
that's just not, that's just not what we can do. But I think it's interesting. So you had all of these, you had these Navy SEALs coming in. They were overweight. They were pre-diabetic. What
No,
else?
they weren't overweight. They just looked like they were overweight in their labs.
On their lab work. Oh,
I mean,
that's
these
even
guys had
more
six.
interesting.
These guys had six-pack abs
Right.
and insulin sensitivity of a pre-diabetic.
So they had insulin. What else did they have besides the
Uh,
insulin sensitivity?
well, so they had low IGF-1.
Uh-huh.
They had low testosterone. They had high estradiol. They had high sex hormone binding globulin. They had
Hmm.
high markers for oxidation, high markers for inflammation,
Hmm.
uh, poor insulin sensitivity, really high resting insulin, fasting insulin, even with reasonably good HbA1cs.
Hmm.
Um, now, the other important thing is that these guys have been listening to Rob Wolf and Dominic D'Agostino and all these guys for years, and these guys,
Yes.
like it's not like these guys were going out and eating McDonald's every meal. Like these guys they were doing everything right. Um, and by this time, we had strength trainers and we had uh, all sorts of athletic supervision for them. We had exercise physiologists and
Hmm.
nutritionists and strength and conditioning
Hmm.
guys and athletic trainers, and we had everything. So these guys were dialed in with what they needed to be doing, and like to look at them, you would go, you know, an amazingly badass looking specimen of a
Right.
30-year-old man. I mean, just like exactly what you would think a Navy SEAL would look like in sort of his prime years. And and to them, like their memory sucked. They had no concentration. They had no motivation. I mean, they're SEALs, so their definition of motivation is different than most
Right.
people's probably. And they're still getting up and doing it. I mean, they're just grinding through and doing everything out
They're
of sheer
pushing.
willpower. They don't
Right.
feel like it. They feel like their body composition is shifting, so they're 10% body fat instead of 8, or maybe 12 if they're really overweight,
Right.
so they're still really lean, but to them, like they're getting weaker, they're getting slower, things hurt more. Their emotionality was just off. Like you know what what we say in the medical, in the medical literature, uh, well, I mean, it's just easier to say, but like uh, they they would get too they get too angry too quick. They would get too sad too quick. They would get too downtrodden too quickly. Like, just this wild vacillation of their normal emotions. You know, they would have problems sitting around their house in a calm, quiet environment and like hanging out with their wife and kids. That would stress them out. They would feel anxious. They would feel super emotional. They have a really short temperature with their kids. They couldn't sleep. And this was the recurring theme that I finally bought onto after a while. But, you know, what would happen is they would come in, they'd come into work really early because they couldn't sleep. And they say, I'm going to work out really hard today. Then I'm going to go straight to work. I'm going to work all day. I'm going to go home. I'm going to have a good dinner. I'm going to go to bed early. I'm going to get a good night's sleep. And I'd say, how long have you been trying? They're like, you know, 3 years or something. You know, like,
right.
Typical. Probably not going to work at this point. And what would happen was they would go in really early, work out really hard, work all day, feel like crap all day, go home, spend some time with their family, and then they would take 2 or 3 Ambien and have a couple of cocktails, and they would fall asleep, go unconscious for 4 hours, 5 hours. They'd wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning, and get up and go to work again the next day.
Right. And that's not true sleep, is it? If they're taking...
No, it's not sleep. It's not sleep.
Right.
It's unconsciousness. So like that's something that I really harp on when I do lectures and when I work with clients, is like the difference between being unconscious and being asleep. And I've gotten away from the super scientific terminology when I'm working with people, when I'm lecturing. And the best thing to instill in people is to just say, you know, every animal on this planet is born into a contract that doesn't matter if they agree with or not. And for humans, we're born into a contract that we need 1/3 of our day to repair from the other 2/3 of our day. And the entire point of being asleep tonight is to make me better tomorrow, or at the very least, just as good as I was today. And so if I push myself today and I do more than my body's capable of, whether that's cognitively, emotionally, physically, it doesn't matter. If I push myself beyond any limitations I have, when I go to sleep tonight, my brain and body are going to use that as the template for what I need to be able to do tomorrow. And then tomorrow, if I can repair 100% tonight, tomorrow I will be better able to handle what I did today than I was today. So every day I'm going to get slightly better. And this is what happens with kids, right? Kids go to sleep and they repair 100%.
Right.
And they wake up the next day a little better, a little smarter, a little better at their skill, a little faster, a little stronger. And they do that until a certain age. And then we get to a point where our epigenetics shift and we don't have enough time to repair 100% overnight. And this is now when we need to start being smart about the periodization of our workouts and when we're eating certain types of food, because we have to kind of push this along to help our recovery so that we can get 100% recovery. But if we only get 99% recovery, you'd say, well, that's pretty damn good. Or let's say 99.9%. That's pretty good, right? It's only 0.1% that you didn't recover. Well, if you do that every day for 50 years, that's what we call aging.
Right.
And so when you aren't sleeping in your 20s and you're using sleep drugs, which don't make you sleep, they make you unconscious, and alcohol, which makes you unconscious, you're not repairing to a much larger degree. So you're essentially aging faster. So at 30, if you do this from 25 to 35, you come sit in my office at 35, feeling like you're 55, and metabolically you are, because you've lost 1/3 or more of your sleep every night for 10 years. Right.
And I find this interesting. You know when you're mentioning metabolically that you're off. I've heard you talk about that when your patients are coming in, it's kind of like this metabolic syndrome type of a.
Yeah, it looks very much like metabolic syndrome.
It looks very much like, and from my own personal experience, when I was 37 years old, I had 3 different offices in 3 different states. I didn't sleep. As a matter of fact,
Smart, wicked smart.
right, Kirk. I'm traveling on a highway. I'm going home. It's like 9 o'clock at night, and
And you're on the phone.
I forget where I am, and I'm looking around for like a minute, and I'm like, wait a second, where am I was so exhausted. I found myself in a hospital. Okay, that heart attack was right there. High blood pressure. My triglycerides were 1227. LDLs, I don't think we even calculated them back then. You know,
Yeah.
they were just outrageous. My HDLs were 8 at that point.
8.
8. They were 8. They were 8. Triglycerides were 1227. I remember sitting across from the cardiologist and him saying to me, with your triglycerides, you're one of the first people that I know that didn't have a fatal heart attack, because, young man, that is extremely high. And I wasn't sleeping. I was driven to make my offices work and have them successful. And it was New Jersey, New York, Connecticut. And there was minimal sleep. And I remember, my wife will tell you this, I remember one Saturday I said, don't bother me. I'm not going into the office. If I get up at 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just let me go.
Yeah.
Because I needed that sleep. My cortisol, my insulin must have been all over the place at that particular juncture. So,
well, do you know Peter Attia? You know who he is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So Peter's a good buddy of mine, and we were talking about sleep probably within the first year of knowing each other. Yeah, I was doing a preparation for my TED talk, and he had shared a story about his residency with me, and I was thinking about using it in my TED talk. And that's when this really hit me full force. You know, at first it was just like an interesting anecdote, but then the more I thought about it, you know, even coming from the SEAL teams, Peter is the most diligent, hardworking, focused guy that I know, by a long shot. And he is, you know, probably an order of magnitude smarter than anybody else I know. Like, this guy has the best resources that any of us could hope to have to get through a normal day, right? And he had done basically a double call shift at Johns Hopkins, I think, and he's coming home, and he's so tired he's falling asleep at stop signs. So any of us, and well, I would hope, like the vast majority of people listening to this would say, well, I'd pull over and sleep, right? Like, if you're falling, like, you know, he's got an hour commute ahead of him. He's 5 minutes away from the hospital, and he's falling asleep behind the wheel. And so that's what he does. But because you're stupid when you are chronically sleep deprived,
right,
he got out of his car and went and laid down in the grass in one of the worst areas of all of Baltimore. He woke up with like rat bites on him, hypodermic syringes in the grass on him.
Right.
Left his keys in his car unlocked, and his car on the curb. And he got out, went and laid down in the grass and went to sleep. Woke up like 4 hours later. It was dark. And he's like, what the hell was I thinking? And he got in his car and he drove off, you know?
And his car was still there.
And his car was still there. And, like, you know, he hadn't been murdered. So, I mean, but the point of that is, there's a ton of research to show that when you're sleep deprived, your performance declines very much on par with alcohol, right? So as you become more and more inebriated, you become more impulsive, your decision making becomes worse, your problem solving becomes worse, your coordination becomes worse, your risk tolerance becomes worse, all of that stuff, right?
Yes.
And all of that happens when you're sleep deprived too. But the one thing that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, in my opinion, is that your self-assessment also behaves just like when you're drinking. So when you drink and you have a couple of drinks, you realize you've had a couple of drinks, and it's probably not a good idea to get in your car and drive home. But
Right.
after you've had 6 drinks, like, I'm fine. Like, I think I'm sober, right? I haven't had a drink in
Right.
13 minutes. I can drive home now. And that's how people get DUIs that are otherwise intelligent, responsible people. Well, sleep does the same thing. When you sleep adapt people, meaning you give them an opportunity to sleep as much as they need to every day until they're just sleeping 8 hours a day. And
Right.
this usually takes like a month to sleep adapt somebody that way. They start sleeping like 12 and a half hours a day. And then they'll whittle down to work to basically sleeping 7.5 to 8 hours per day. That's what everyone just kind of, and now they're sleep adapted. And now you can take them and you can test them on anything you want. Doesn't matter. You can teach them something new. You can test them on something they already know. It can be strength. It can be speed. It can be cognitive. It can be reaction time. It can be problem
Right.
solving. Doesn't matter. You test them on anything after they've been sleep adapted. Then you take 2 hours of sleep away from them. So now they sleep 6 hours, which is what the average American sleeps. They're
Right.
sleeping 6 hours instead of 8. And then you test them the next day. They'll do a lot worse. They'll do like 20 to 30% worse,
Right.
depending on what you're testing them on. But they'll do significantly worse. And then you ask them, how do you think you did? I did worse. I felt really bad. I feel tired. I know I did worse.
Right.
You did. Same thing happens day 2. Same thing happens day 3. By day 4, almost 100% of people will say, I feel like I did as good as I've ever done. I'm totally adapted to this new schedule. I feel just fine sleeping 6 hours a night. I think I'm working at my full potential. And
Right.
you can show them, nope, you're still going down at the exact same trajectory as you were when you knew you were going down.
Right.
And that's what doesn't get the attention. And that's what happened to you. So you were decaying in probably every category of your life that you could think to categorize. You were in a state of decay,
Right.
but you weren't aware of it. You couldn't see it in yourself.
Was not aware of it at all. Type A personality, I'll sleep when I die type of a thing, right? That's like the business ruse, right? I'm going to
The
sleep.
good news is you'll get there a lot quicker.
Right. And yes, you can definitively get there a lot quicker.
Yeah.
And I was going down. I was going down significantly. Adrenals
Yep.
shot. And how do not that I'm mentioning adrenal fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder, how does this all come into with sleep? And I'm sure we can even add in, in the SEALs combat fatigue. Is that all kind of related?
Yeah. So the traumatic brain injury specifically, so we have both types. So we have blunt force, right?
Mm-hmm.
So because we do combatives and
Mm-hmm.
people fall off of buildings and ropes and whatever. I mean, people get hit in the head and we get regular concussions.
Sure.
But what we have a lot more of is blast trauma, right? So
Mm-hmm.
in 2009, after I went to Mark Gordon's lecture, I started researching on TBIs. I was so compelled by his cases. I'm like, well, let me see if this fits my guys. And I start reading, and there's a journal article in JAMA 2009. It was done between Harvard and Oxford. And they had done DTIs, which is an imaging where they can see a single neuronal tract break.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very, very, very mild TBI, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they were basically looking for the threshold of at what point do you start damaging your brain? And they found the threshold to be 1.09 Gs. And they found single neuronal tracts, which is, now granted, this isn't a significant enough TBI to where that would impact your life. I mean, maybe if you did it every day, but they found these mild traumatic brain injuries from the acceleration changes on a roller coaster. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
These guys weren't hitting their heads on anything. They were just bouncing around on a roller coaster and they would break neuronal tracts.
Mm-hmm.
So 1.09 Gs seemed to be the threshold. Once you get past that, the average person starts breaking neurons.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you go into a concrete room and you're practicing CQC and you're shooting machine guns in a concrete room, every bullet that comes out of each barrel is 35 Gs. 35 Gs with every bullet. You're doing this thousands of times per day with just your gun.
Right.
Not to mention the other, 3 to 5 people who are in the room with you. and you're doing this over, like you're doing this 12 hours a day for 6 days a week.
Right.
You know, a hard parachute opening, you know, is like 3 to 4 Gs. Our fast boats, like Dev Group's fast boats, they trained it. They've measured these boats. Their average transit G-force is 60 Gs. They peaked well over 100 Gs when they hit waves just wrong. You know, our anti-armory or anti-tank weapons, the Carl Gustav, the guy shooting it gets 200 Gs. The guy spotting it gets 300 Gs.
Wow.
And so at this point, I'm like, all right, well, I don't have a single guy who doesn't have TBI, right?
Right.
And I don't have a single guy who doesn't have thousands of them. And so, you know, we, you know, we've had our suicide epidemic like the NFL, and there were guys with wherewithal to deliberately shoot themselves in the chest to try to have their brains examined, and it's not the same pattern as the CTE that professional athletes have. They usually have some of that, but they have this complete diffuse brain inflammation, and they have more cell death in it through greater locations of their brain. So we know that that's destroying our guys. Now, there's very little we can do about that. What we can do about that is be aware of that and like not have people shoot 20 Carl Gustavs in a day or something. You know, like you shoot, you know, you shoot the minimum you need to shoot something like that in training. And you try to give people downtime, and you have things like hyperbaric facilities. You teach people around the nutrition of that. You know, the EPA and DHA and you know, all of the things that we know that we can use to help repair the brain faster, to, you know, decrease the stimulation to the or decrease all forms of stimulation, to, you know, to get as much quiet rest as possible, to meditate, to do float tanks, to do hyperbarics, like all of the things that we can possibly do, and we can mitigate against whatever damage we're doing, but we're damaging it. But life is damage. Everybody damages their body every day. Like, you know, the ideal is to die with a completely worn out brain and body, right? Not a perfectly intact. So we can mitigate against that, but the sleep makes all of that exponentially worse. So one of the things that we know is that when in that example where you're just taking what's called sleep restriction, where you're just taking away 2 hours of sleep every night. So one of the things we know is that when you do that, when you take away 2 hours of sleep every night consistently over the course of about 11 days, you will perform exactly as though you are above the legal limit for intoxication. So you will perform, I think 0.08 is the legal limit. I think you'll perform at a 0.1 after 24 hours of being awake, or after missing 2 hours of sleep a night for 11 days in a row. Now, if you've ever stayed up 2 days in a row, you know what a useless bag or whatever you are at that point.
Right.
Well, if you sleep 2 hours less than you need every night for 20 days in a row, you perform exactly as though you haven't slept for 2 days. And your self-awareness of that is the same. You don't realize that your performance is impaired. You think you're doing just fine. And your performance shows exactly the opposite.
It's right.
And when you take anyone at any phase of that, whether you're keeping them up all night or sleep restricting them, and you give them alcohol and test them afterwards, their physical and cognitive impairment happens twice as fast when they're sleep deprived. So it's very, 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 very likely that traumatic brain injuries are twice as dangerous when you're sleep deprived.
When you're sleep deprived.
And they're going to last longer and be harder to recover from while being sleep deprived.
Right. There is a neuropsychologist that has asked me within the last month to join his team, and he's looking at concussions, TBIs at the NFL level, and I'm going to lead the functional medicine, biochemical aspect of this, and I think I'm going to get you guys together, because I think that we'll be able to do some good work with this. And, we'll talk about that when we're done, but it's very interesting research that's going on. I want to change gears here because, my son came in before, he said hello to you, right?
Yep.
And, let's change gears now that I'm thinking about this, because children are sleep deprived. My son is on his phone, YouTube. My son he doesn't do Fortnite anymore, but he's doing something else. I don't even know what it is. And we caught him up 2:00 in the morning, several nights, and he plays hockey, plays it at a very high level. And I can tell you, the coaches were like, his performance during this time was significantly decreased. And not only that, when he is sleep deprived, and it's the summertime now, and he's been diagnosed, I'm going to share that he's been diagnosed with ADHD, and his ADHD is actually worse when there's some sleep depression, so.
I talk about this all the time.
Yeah.
So in my humble medical opinion, you cannot diagnose ADD while someone is sleep deprived. If you look at the literature of the symptoms of ADHD or ADD, and you look at the symptoms from chronic sleep deprivation, they are identical. So if you are diagnosing a child who isn't sleeping enough with ADD, I recommend taking a step back, optimizing the kid's sleep, because most of the ADD treatments are going to interfere with their sleep even more, make them more tired. The reason kids go up on things like Adderall, the reason their dosages climb isn't because their brains need more stimulation than they used to, because their ADD is getting worse. It's because they're progressively becoming more and more sleep deprived, because what sleep they are getting isn't as high of quality. We didn't get into the adrenals in there, but this ties intimately with the adrenals. So
let's get into the adrenals too, because I think that's extremely important. Yes.
Yeah. So I explain it this way. Again, I like to do things that the listeners can remember and grab a hold to. And then if you want to get geeky research level in that, you can go do that on your own. Like you have Google. You don't need me for that. But so there's a couple of important concepts to realize how completely interrelated these are. Probably almost everybody listening has heard of something called fight or flight, right? And fight or flight, simplistically speaking, is the maximal stress response that your body is able to generate. And it does this in a situation where you feel there's grave threat to you or somebody that you love or care about. There's a grave threat to you or others. So, like, you're going to die or be maimed or seriously harmed if this threat doesn't go away. And we have an innate system, right, that's kept us alive, right? Our ancestors that whose amygdala didn't fire off when the tiger stripe pattern crept through the bushes, 100 yards away. The ones who didn't see that, those aren't our ancestors, most likely, right? They probably didn't procreate. Now, interestingly, that's almost a symptom of ADD these days, right? Catching that kind of movement.
Right.
But I digress. So what happens when you go into fight or flight is essentially the organism that is you has made the determination that there's only one important thing. There's only one thing that matters right now, and it's getting away from that threat. Because if you don't get away from that threat, all else is lost. So it doesn't matter. So I'm going to shut down everything unnecessary. I'm going to cash in all of my savings, and I'm going to spend it all right now to be faster and stronger and have higher pain threshold, have more endurance. I'm going to mobilize all my stored glycogen, so I'm going to have high blood glucose. My pupils are going to dilate. They're going to take in way more light in a bigger span of distance. My pulmonary tree is going to dilate. I'm going to take in more oxygen. My heart rate's going to accelerate. My perfusion to to certain areas is going to decrease and it's going to increase to others. And I'm going to be the biggest, I'm going to be the fastest, strongest, most agile, most impulsive, right? Because I don't want to think this through. You don't think through getting away from a tiger. You impulsively react and get away from it, right? This is what keeps us alive. Now, the question is, why don't we just run around like that all the time? If I can be that strong and that enduring and have that high of a pain threshold and those reflexes and that vision, and like, why don't I do that all the time? Because nothing else is happening. Everything else that doesn't matter has been shut down. My digestion isn't working. I'm not producing any sex hormones whatsoever. My reproductive system isn't working. I'm not fighting off infection. I'm not repairing any damage. And my brain isn't working. My prefrontal cortex has shut off because I need to be impulsive. I need to purely rely on my senses. And this is the processor of what's going on back there. So I don't need this part of me. I don't need to problem solve. I don't need to be able to remember my phone number. I don't need to know how to do math. Like, I need to be able to get away from the tiger. So that's fight or flight. So keep that in mind. What's going on, superhuman physical capabilities, everything else has gone to pot. Like, all of your physiological maintenance is gone. You've cashed in all your savings. That is a catabolic state. We are taking big things, breaking them down into small things, right? Complex things into simple things. We're catabolically breaking down. The exact opposite of fight or flight is deep sleep. Slow wave sleep is the lowest amount of stress hormones you will ever have during a 24-hour period. And when you're in slow wave sleep, the exact same thing, the exact opposite things are happening. Everything gets shut down during fight or flight is maximized. Your immune system is functioning at its highest. You're repairing everything that you've damaged. You're fighting off infections. You're fighting off parasites. Your sex hormones are being produced. All of the things, your digestion, nutritional stores, partitioning, fuel, all that stuff is happening at a maximal level while you're in deep sleep. You drink alcohol, you don't get any deep sleep. You take sleep drugs, you lose about 50% of your deep sleep. Okay, so we have this problem now, right? If we need the deep sleep to repair, and you think about it, my body's essentially useless. It's the exact opposite of fight or flight. I couldn't get away from anything. I'd have a hard time sensing them. But, my eyes still work. My ears still work, right? Like, everything still works. Like, I'm just not paying attention to anything. So I'm in deep sleep and I'm repairing, and I'm getting myself, as I said earlier, I'm getting myself ready for tomorrow. Everything that cost me today, I'm trying to pay back and build up a little bit of savings to be a little bit better tomorrow. Now, tomorrow, if I don't get 8 hours of sleep tonight and I wake up only 80% repaired or 75% repaired, tomorrow still comes. I still have to do tomorrow. So how do I do it? Adrenals.
You don't.
I crank up my adrenals.
Right.
And I do the same thing that I do on my way to fight or flight. I'm just not at fight or flight levels, but I start making myself catabolic as a fuel source to compensate for my lack of repair during the night.
Yes.
So at this point, you carry this far enough along, it doesn't matter why you don't have enough adrenal function. One thing, like, you aren't going to produce enough adrenal function to compensate for your lack of sleep unless you're running around at fight or flight all the time, and we know how long that would last. Like, you die in a 4 or 5 hours probably of living like that. So everything that's costing you is being made up for by breaking your tissues down, by taking away functions that you should have. So you're getting the dumber bit, you're getting a lower immune system, you're getting all of that stuff. So the more days you string together, the more adrenal function you need. And this is why you can have people who look like they're in adrenal fatigue who have astronomically high cortisol levels. Like, well, how can that be true?
Right.
Well, they're not in adrenal fatigue, they're in an HPTA mismatch. They can't produce enough to compensate for the deficits they've created.
Right.
And so I initially started treating team guys for adrenal fatigue. And I literally had guys whose cortisols were unmeasurable. So I don't even know how they were alive.
Right.
But I also had guys who had 5 times, the normal amount. 24-hour catches were were usually either really high or really low, but very rarely were they within sort of the reference ranges.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
yeah. So my point is those two are really indistinguishable because
Right.
the adrenal mismatch is a consequence of sleep deprivation, and then unfortunately, the only time that any animal on the planet sleep deprives themselves, other than humans, is when they're under stress. And there's only really two forms of being under stress. They're being preyed upon, they're being stalked, or they're starving.
Right.
And under both of those circumstances, they'll essentially go into this hyper adrenal function,
Right.
and they will sleep less so that they can forage more. And the one of the functions of the high adrenals is to make you more impulsive. And this is why animals who are starving will get really close to humans when they ordinarily wouldn't, right? And they'll try eating things that they've never tried eating before. It's like, well, maybe I could eat this. I don't know. I'm starving. And so you become more impulsive. Well, humans do the same thing. So then you run into all of these impulsivity problems. And that is just like being drunk. And that's when you're making stupid mistakes at your job. And you're making stupid mistakes while you're driving. You're putting your health, other people's health at risk. You're making ridiculous risk with your finances, with your personal relationships, everything.
Yeah, all of those executive functions from that frontal cortex just goes out the window.
Yep.
At that point in time when you're sleep deprived.
And then if you get on a diet, that gets even worse because we have that same mechanism in our brain.
Yes.
Same mechanism of our brain that other animals have. We're starving. We need more adrenal function, more catabolic, leads to more sugar cravings and more fat cravings. And eventually, this is your willpower. You shut off enough of the prefrontal cortex, willpower doesn't exist anymore. It does nothing to do with how disciplined you are. You'll get out of your car and lay down in a park in the middle of Baltimore when you're one of the most brilliant people on the planet. Because when this is impaired enough, you will do the dumbest, just like somebody gets drunk enough, what won't they do?
So what we're talking about for our listeners, sleep deprivation really has a lot of far-reaching effects. Cognitive dysfunction can lead into a metabolic syndrome. It can even lead into cancers, diabetes, increased risk of hyperlipidemia, and as Dr. Parsley was saying, financial situations that can lead.
A single night of short sleep, so 2 hours less than you need, decreases insulin sensitivity in some tissues by up to 30%. Decreases your problem-solving ability, your cognitive scores, like all your executive functioning like that we're talking about, decreases your testosterone, decreases your insulin, I already said it, decreases your insulin sensitivity, decreases your leptin sensitivity, increases your ghrelin. So you become a hormonal mess right away. Now, you string that along, there is, of course, a physiologic cost of this because you aren't repairing every day. And if you aren't repairing every day, something's got to give. And eventually that's your life. And so when you look at people, I mean, you look at, you talk about cancer. The World Health Organization classifies shift work as a type 2A carcinogen, the same as cigarettes, right? Because we know that when you metabolically disrupt yourself for 20 or 30 years, you're more likely to get any disease. People who work shift work, like their whole careers as cops that are working night shift, those people, they die 16 years earlier than the average American. When you look at people who use sleep drugs chronically, which is only defined as more than 6 months, when you use sleep drugs chronically, you die 12 years earlier on average. Now, people think that's from the sleep drug. I don't think so. It's from the sleep deprivation, because when you look at people who don't take sleep drugs but are chronically sleep deprived, they die 12 years earlier too. So basically any disease, any morbidity, any mortality, any cause mortality, any morbidity is greatly increased. You can get on Google and scare yourself to death. You go in there and just put in sleep and anything that you care about. Like anything. And you go through PubMed, there will be article after article after article relating sleep deprivation to an impairment of that physiologic function or that capability or an increase of that disease or that whatever.
And it like we were saying, it just has these far reaching effects. We're actually an hour and like 10 minutes into this. So I could go on for another 2 hours. I think what we're going to do is
I think your audience wouldn't appreciate listening to me blather that long.
You know what? We're gonna have you come back on in a couple of months if that's okay with you, because I think I got like a quarter of the questions I wanted to ask you.
All right.
So we're gonna have you come back on, Dr. Parsley. So tell us about the sleep remedy and where can individuals purchase this. And I'm going to get in touch with your office. I want to put a link onto my website so they can go directly to your website, but we're going to put a link on. I have that for when the podcast comes out. So be able to link our websites together so that, patients of mine can purchase this product.
Okay. Well, so we didn't really get into, the ancestral design of sleep, but I think most people know you decrease the light in your, it's called the photoperiod.
I have that here. Yes, that we wanted to. Yes.
Yeah. So you decrease that, and that leads to a cascade of events in your brain. And one of the primary initiators is a hormone most people have heard of called melatonin. But melatonin doesn't make you go to sleep. Melatonin is kind of like this. Matt Walker calls it the starter pistol of the cascade. So like that initiates everything that's changing, and a bunch of changes going on in your brain. And about 3 hours after the sun goes down, hunter-gatherers who don't live with electricity and our ancestors, about 3 hours later they fall asleep. There's no stimulation around. There's no bright light. Their world has shrunk in. They aren't seeing and smelling, and like there's not as much to take in. So you decrease that, and so this is how the brain's designed to work. But we live in this world with all sorts of stimulation, and all sorts of light, and like we don't spend 3 hours getting ready for bed, and so. All that I've done with my sleep formulation is I said, what would ordinarily build up in your brain during those 3 hours, right? And it would be essentially the melatonin production pathway. So melatonin doesn't just get secreted once. It's a pulsatile secretion all throughout the night. Cortisol eventually comes up to a high enough level and it starts shutting all that off. And it's actually cortisol levels that wake you up in the morning.
Yes.
So the melatonin production pathway, people have heard of the tryptophan coma, Thanksgiving Day, right? So tryptophan.
The turkey sleeps.
What's that?
You get the turkey sleeps.
Yeah, the turkey sleep. And not because there's especially a high amount of tryptophan in turkey, but nobody overeats steak as much as they overeat turkey or something, right?
Right.
So so tryptophan becomes 5-hydroxytryptophan with the cofactors of vitamin D3 and magnesium. 5-hydroxytryptophan becomes serotonin. Serotonin then becomes melatonin. Mm-hmm. Melatonin initiates all these cascades. One of the big events of the cascades afterwards is that it produces a neuropeptide called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, and that kind of slows down the cortex and makes us quit paying attention to our environment as much because we don't want to pay attention to our environment. It's actually the definition of being asleep is a lack of awareness of your environment.
Right.
And so all that I put in my supplement is the tryptophan pathway, maybe the first pulse of the night of melatonin, just like a super light dusting of that. Right. The GABA to increase, or to decrease, slow down the neocortex. L-theanine because it enhances the effects of GABA, and then phosphatidylserine because it decreases cortisol.
Right.
So there's no tricks in there. It's like I'm bringing the lumber to the construction site, but like your body still has to do the work, your brain still has to do the work. Like there's nothing magic in there that makes people go to sleep. It just puts you in the best possible environment to be able to go to sleep if you're doing everything else approximately right. Like I said, I developed it to get the seals off of Ambien, and 100% of the seals who came to me to get off of Ambien got off of Ambien, and that's what they used instead.
Yeah, that was my question.
I know it works.
Right. That was my question. You got 100% of the seals off of the Ambien.
Yeah. Well, 100% of them who wanted to get off, I got
Who
off.
wanted to get off. You,
Yeah.
you know what? Sometimes the most simple ideas are the best ideas. You're like, okay, I got a dusting of this, I got some of this, I got some of this, but yet it's the most effective. It's the best idea.
Yeah. Well, oh, I mean, that to me, like, that's what a supplement is, right? That's what a supplement's supposed to be. I'm
Right,
supplementing something that's already there. Now,
right,
there's all sorts of herbs and things that have been postulated to help people with sleep and decrease anxiety and do all sorts of other stuff. But you don't have a deficiency of herbs. So I'm not poo-pooing those ideas, and those might be good ideas. But
right,
like my training is like in normal, normal and diseased anatomy and physiology. So like
right,
that's what I know. So
right.
all I'm trying to do is reapproximate normal physiology.
Right. And in my office as a functional medicine clinical nutritionist, that's what we do. We work with the metabolism and we work with the biochemistry, trying to normalize that and normalize physiology. Where can my listeners get your sleep remedy?
Um, well, you can actually go to sleepremedy.com, and that will land on my website, which is docparsley.com. So either way, look up docparsley.com, or if you can remember Doc Parsley, if you can remember Parsley, probably it'll come up.
Yeah, you can just put that in there, right? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You know, and we're going to have a link to everything on the podcast, and we're going to see if we could put that on a link on my website.
And I really want to come back and talk more about your son, because
I think that's a whole
that's my new passion. Like I'm
right.
sorry that we didn't go further with that. That was the first of 10 points I wanted to make about kids and sleep today.
I think this is extremely important, and I think what I'll do is when we're done here, I'm gonna get in touch. I think it's with Megan, and let's see what we can do in it's August now. We're at the end of July, beginning of August. So let's look at a date in September, and because I think it is extremely important. When he doesn't sleep, the ADHD. I mean, teachers are telling me he gets up in the middle of the class. And it's not only him, he's going to this private type of a school. There's a lot of pressure on him. And, he even to me, there's a lot of pressure. So that we will take a whole podcast on children. I think that's a great idea. And I
actually did a 4-day lecture series on kids and sleep. It was 8 hours a day for 4 days. I felt sorry for the audience, but they were interested. They wanted to hear it. So
listen, you know what? As I always say at the end of the podcast, we have the best of the best of the best. Doc Parsley, I mean, the information that you have given from Navy SEAL, medical physician, and how you're helping out all of these, all of your patients. It's just truly amazing. Again, thank you for your service. Thank you for coming on. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to meet with you and talk. Let's get on next month and let's talk children and sleep deprivation, which I think is extremely important. We'll call this one. The next podcast we'll call part 2, and we'll go for it.
That's creative.
Any pearls, any sleep pearls before we go?
Here's the number one sleep pearl. We had this saying in SEALs that really stuck with me. When somebody would put a task before you that just seemed completely insurmountable, they would if you made any objections, they'd pause it to you. And this is, keep in mind, this is late 80s and early 90s, so $1 million was a lot of money then. They would say, if I gave you $1 million, would you be able to figure out how to do it? And you say, yeah, I could do that for $1 million. They're like, well, then you can do it without the $1 million. So the number one thing to improving your sleep is to convince yourself that sleep is the most important thing. I mean, that is by far, I work with private clients. I charge them an obscene amount of money, and it's still the hardest thing for me to do is to get them to sleep. People have to convince themselves, but it's just like the $1 million, right? If I gave you $10 million to sleep 8 hours a night for 30 days in a row, within the next 6 months, how many people do you think wouldn't be able to do that?
Everybody's going to do it.
Everybody would be able to do it. So you can do it without the $10 million.
Right.
You just need to go on, you need to get your Google on and get in there. And like I said, put in sleep and anything you care about.
Right.
Sleep and parenting, sleep and work, sleep and performance, strength. I don't
All
care.
of that. Right.
Anything you care about, intimate relationships, sexual performance, like whatever you value, sleep and that. And
Everything.
convince yourself that the fastest way to break yourself and make you bad at all of those areas and to decrease your possibilities in all of those areas is by not sleeping enough. I used to teach that there are 4 pillars of health, and sleep was one of them, and sleep, nutrition, exercise, and stress mitigation.
Right.
Now I say there's 3 pillars and a foundation, and the foundation is sleep.
It would be the sleep. Correct. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And for myself, in my own practice, you know, I'm asking more and more about sleep, and we're trying to incorporate it more into the consult and the physical exam, because what we're finding out is those that are having the metabolic syndrome, and I see a lot of patients with metabolic syndrome. I had that metabolic syndrome.
Yeah.
So there's no coincidence that I'm getting those types of individuals in, and we're looking at their sleep patterns. So we're going to be looking at that more. Dr. Parsley, thank you very much for coming on.
You're very welcome. Thanks for letting me on.
You know, great conversation. Part 2 coming up in about a month. Children and sleep deprivation. Thank you very much. Honored to meet you.
Likewise.
Take care, everybody. Until the next time, keep it going. We'll talk soon.